On 13 November 1894, in Imperial Berlin, Arthur Nebe was born into a state that defined loyalty through service and discipline. And when the First World War began, he entered it as a reserve officer shaped not by ideology, but by procedures of command, casualty lists, and the daily administration of violence. The front did not teach him heroism, it taught him hierarchy, endurance, and the logic that survival depended on adherence to orders rather than reflection, a lesson reinforced by his wounding and return to a defeated capital where authority had collapsed without being replaced by a stable alternative. Berlin after 1918 was a city of armed patrols, emergency decrees, political assassinations, and paramilitary formations, where legality shifted weekly and violence became routine. And in this environment, Nebe made a decision that was neither dramatic nor emotional, entering the criminal police as a professional refuge from political chaos. The criminal Polizei of the Weimar Republic was rebuilding itself amid instability, and Nebe advanced by embracing methods that promised predictability, record-keeping, statistical evaluation, centralized files, and interdepartmental coordination that treated crime as a measurable phenomenon rather than a moral failure. Throughout the 1920s, he distinguished himself not as an investigator driven by individual cases, but as an organizer who believed that control lay in classification and foresight, contributing to the professionalization of the Berlin Kripo as an institution capable of managing disorder through administrative means. Inflation, coups, and street battles did not radicalize him. They confirmed his conviction that politics were unreliable while institutions endured, and that personal beliefs were irrelevant next to functional efficiency. When National Socialism moved from agitation to power, Nebe's entry into the NSDAP and later the SS followed the same pattern as his earlier choices, an alignment with the structure that offered expanded authority, clearer chains of command, and access to resources, undertaken as a career calculation rather than a declaration of faith. By 1933, shaped by war, defeat, and bureaucratic policing, Nebe stood fully formed as an administrative actor prepared to serve any state that promised order, unaware or indifferent to how far that promise would soon be pushed, and the mechanism he had chosen was about to redefine what order itself meant. After January 1933, the German police system did not collapse. It was absorbed, reassembled, and reassigned, and Arthur Nebe operated inside this process not as a propagandist, but as a functional intermediary between old professional routines and new political directives. The criminal police, previously a civil institution of the federal states, was gradually stripped of autonomy and drawn into a centralized structure that fused investigative practice with ideological purpose. And Nebe participated in this transition by translating political demands into administrative forms that investigators could execute without redefining themselves as believers. The reorganization culminated in the integration of the Kripo with the Gestapo and the SD under the umbrella of the Reich Security Main Office, where distinctions between political policing and criminal investigation became procedural rather than substantive. Nebe's task was not to invent ideology, but to operationalize it, ensuring that registries, cross-referenced indexes, and preventive detention mechanisms could process individuals defined not by acts but by categories. Crime expanded from behavior to condition, and new classifications such as asocial, Roma, Jews, habitual offenders, and the socially marginal were inserted into police logic through circulars, decrees, and standardized reporting language that reframed exclusion as prevention. The efficiency of this system lay in its neutrality of tone, where repression appeared as routine administration, and Nebe's authority rested on his ability to guarantee reliability, predictability, and statistical clarity. Investigators no longer asked why a group was targeted. They asked how many files were complete, how quickly actions could be executed, and whether reports aligned with expectations from above. The police apparatus became a conveyor belt in which ideological goals were achieved through procedural compliance rather than emotional commitment, and Nebe's role was to keep that belt moving without friction. By the end of the 1930s, the transformation was complete. The criminal police had ceased to be an institution that responded to crime and had become one that anticipated deviation. And Nebe, having helped embed ideology into routine, stood at the center of a system where legality was defined by order and order by obedience, setting the conditions for a far more radical application of the same administrative logic. By the end of the 1930s, Arthur Nebe no longer operated on the margins of authority, but inside its core. Formally appointed head of the Reich Criminal Police and integrated into the SS command system that bound police work directly to the political will of the regime. His position was defined less by visibility than by placement within chains of subordination that ran upward to Heinrich Himmler and operationally through Reinhard Heydrich, creating a structure in which responsibility flowed vertically while accountability dissolved horizontally. Nebe's authority lay in coordination, in ensuring that investigative units, regional offices, and specialized departments functioned as a single organism producing consistent outputs, and his proximity to power was measured in access to briefings, not in public prominence. This phase of his career revealed the mature form of his professional identity, an administrator who understood that survival at the top required the ability to reconcile factual investigation with political necessity, without openly challenging either. The investigation following the assassination attempt by Georg Elser exposed this balance with particular clarity, as Nebe's apparatus identified the lone perpetrator, while higher authorities demanded confirmation of a broader conspiracy, forcing investigative practice to adapt to expectations rather than evidence. Nebe navigated this tension by delivering conclusions that preserved procedural legitimacy while satisfying ideological demands, demonstrating that in the Nazi system, truth was acceptable only when it did not disrupt the narrative required by leadership. His loyalty was expressed not through speeches or declarations, but through reliability, the assurance that when politically sensitive cases arose, the Kripo would produce usable results on schedule. At this peak, doubt had no institutional place because the system rewarded certainty measured in completed files and closed cases, and Nebe's confidence stemmed from his mastery of this environment. Yet this same certainty, built on administrative success, would soon be tested when policing was no longer limited to investigation and detention, but reassigned to direct, organized killing under military conditions, a transition that would expose the final implications of power exercised without hesitation. In June 1941, with the launch of the war against the Soviet Union, Arthur Nebe was temporarily removed from the administrative center and reassigned to the operational frontier, appointed commander of Einsatzgruppe B, a decision that did not interrupt his career logic but extended it into a new field of application. The unit was subordinated through the security police to the Reich Security Main Office, supplied with written directives, territorial zones of responsibility, and a reporting system that mirrored the routines of criminal police administration, transforming occupied space into an abstract grid of tasks and outputs. Einsatzgruppe B operated in the rear areas of Army Group Center, following advancing Wehrmacht formations and applying security orders that defined entire populations as threats to be neutralized. And Nebe's command emphasized organization, delegation, and documentation, rather than personal presence at execution sites. The structure was precise: subunits assigned to cities and regions, daily and weekly situation reports sent to Berlin, numerical summaries that reduced actions to totals, and standardized language that described shootings as special measures and security operations. Within this framework, mass murder appeared not as an extraordinary act, but as a continuation of preventative policing by other means, and Nebe treated it accordingly, focusing on efficiency, coordination with military authorities, and the regularity of reporting. His participation extended beyond command responsibility into experimentation, as Einsatzgruppe B became a testing ground for methods intended to reduce logistical strain and psychological burden on personnel, including early gas-based killing techniques later institutionalized elsewhere. These initiatives were discussed not in moral terms, but as technical problems requiring solutions, framed by memoranda and oral briefings that evaluated outcomes through effectiveness rather than consequence. The absence of emotional language in surviving documents was not accidental. It was a functional requirement that allowed the process to scale without resistance from within the bureaucracy. By the end of his assignment, tens of thousands had been killed under Nebe's authority, yet the records reflected only completed tasks and cumulative figures, reinforcing a system in which responsibility dissolved into procedure. When Nebe was recalled to Berlin later in 1941, Einsatzgruppe B continued its operations seamlessly, demonstrating that the apparatus no longer depended on individual initiative and that the administrative logic he embodied had reached its most lethal form, raising the unresolved question of how such a man would later redefine his position once the war began to turn against the state he served. When Arthur Nebe returned to Berlin in late 1941 and formally resumed leadership of the Reich Criminal Police, the war had already entered a new phase in which victory was no longer assumed but administratively maintained, and his position once again placed him at the intersection of continuity and crisis. The Kripo, now fully embedded within the Reich Security Main Office, functioned as a stabilizing instrument for a regime under pressure, tasked with internal security, counter-sabotage, and the management of a population increasingly defined by suspicion and scarcity. Nebe's work during these years reflected a duality that did not register as contradiction within the system. By day, he oversaw police coordination, international liaison with allied and occupied state forces, and the refinement of registries and investigative routines, while by night he maintained contact with circles of military and civilian officials who spoke cautiously of a Germany beyond Hitler. These contacts did not remove him from the machinery of repression. On the contrary, his authority within it continued unabated, as demonstrated after the escape of Allied prisoners from Stalag Luft 3 in March 1944, when Nebe's police apparatus participated in the manhunt and subsequent executions ordered from above. The same professional efficiency that enabled conspiratorial discretion also ensured that repressive measures were carried out swiftly and without procedural disruption. Nebe's involvement with resistance figures was framed not as defiance but as contingency planning, an exploration of alternatives conducted from within the system rather than outside it, and his continued service illustrated the central ambiguity of this period: the belief that one could prepare for a post-Hitler future while remaining an effective administrator of Hitler's state. The regime tolerated no such ambiguity, yet Nebe operated as if compartmentalization were possible, separating future intentions from present duties through the same bureaucratic logic that had structured his entire career. By mid-1944, the contradiction sharpened as surveillance intensified and trust narrowed, and Nebe's position as both enforcer and potential dissident became increasingly unstable, foreshadowing a moment when institutional loyalty would be tested not by policy shifts but by personal survival, and when the administrative man would be forced into a decision the system itself could not accommodate. After 20 July 1944, the structure that Arthur Nebe had served for more than a decade reacted with mechanical speed, and the same security apparatus he had helped refine turned inward, isolating, tracing, and eliminating those connected to the failed attempt on Hitler's life. In the first days after the explosion at the Wolf's Lair, Nebe did not disappear from instinct or panic, but followed a pattern familiar to him as a police professional, cutting contacts, avoiding fixed locations, and relying on informal networks rather than institutional channels, fully aware of how rapidly the investigative net would tighten. For several months he remained in hiding, protected not by ideology, but by the remnants of personal loyalty and administrative blind spots, while the state mobilized its resources against its own elite. His arrest in January 1945 marked not a dramatic confrontation, but a procedural endpoint, the reclassification of a former senior official into a security problem to be processed. The subsequent trial before the People's Court was neither judicial nor investigative in nature, presided over by Roland Freisler, and functioned as a public ritual of condemnation designed to reaffirm authority through spectacle rather than establish facts. Nebe's previous service, rank, and usefulness offered no protection, and his participation in the conspiracy was presented not as political dissent but as personal betrayal, severing him symbolically from the system he had embodied. Sentenced to death, he was executed at Plötzensee prison in March 1945, his career ending not in absolution but in administrative disposal, processed like countless others whose files he had once overseen. The conclusion imposed by the regime was final but not redemptive, demonstrating that participation in resistance did not negate prior actions and that the system recognized no cumulative credit for loyalty once utility expired. Nebe's trajectory revealed the final limit of responsibility within a totalitarian order, where efficiency substituted for judgment, and where even those who sought to maneuver within the structure were ultimately consumed by the same logic they had helped institutionalize, leaving behind not a story of repentance, but a record of service that remained intact until the moment it was erased.